Q&A period at the end of that. So please submit your questions. And we've got two young ladies. We have SJ and Amy who are going to be looking at all those comments and culling those. And so in the midst of everything that's going on right now, in the midst of this pandemic and the midst of this economic calamity, we also have this contentious, difficult social challenge that is happening right now in our lives. And it's an important time for this conversation about Black lives, about the relationship between the Black community and the police, and about how all of us can contribute to de-escalating the violence that's happening in our society right now. So a special welcome to those of you who are on Facebook. I saw that we just now went live on Facebook. I want to say thank you for joining us. We're glad to have you with us. And we'd ask you to do us a quick favor, lean forward and click the share button and share this live broadcast with your network of friends and spread this conversation even wider and to a bigger audience. Again, I'm Reggie Rivers. I'll be your moderator. We are blessed to have with us today. We have Judge Gary Jackson, Representative Carrie Tipper, Tyrone Glover, Chris Martin, and Sarah Scott. And we're going to meet them right now, starting with you, Judge Jackson. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Reggie. It's really an honor to be on this panel. To tell you about myself, first of all, I have been a judge and a lawyer now for 50 years. I have been on the Denver County Court bench for 8 years. I was born and raised in Denver, a graduate of George Washington High School. I went to CU undergrad, CU Law School, and I'm first generation college. My mom and dad did not go to college. I am the first member of my family to be a lawyer, and I'm, of course, the first member of my family to be a judge. I began my career as a Denver Deputy District Attorney in 1970, and then I became an Assistant U.S. Attorney. And in both of those jobs, I was the only Black prosecutor in the state as a Deputy DA, and the only Black prosecutor as an Assistant U.S. Attorney. I owned my own law firm after I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, was the owner of a law firm for 37 years. What I'm proud about are the lawyers and associates that worked with me in my law firm, because they became the founder of APAPA, the Asian American Pacific Bar Association. Lucy Denson. Nithit Pawar became the founder of SABA, the South Asian Bar Association. My other associate, Dan Sweetser, he became the president-elect of the Denver Bar Association. So in my law firm, we had a group of leaders. Early in my career, I was one of the co-founders of the Sam Carey Bar Association, as well as the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar. A point of pride, my son is a lawyer. My daughter is a school psychologist. For the past 8 years, I have been doing trials in the Denver County Court. And so I started my career in public service, and I am so pleased that I'm ending my career in public service.
Hey, we appreciate that, Judge. And just one quick note, I know that there are some questions you may not be able to answer this afternoon. And do you want to explain to the audience why that is?
Well, the reason why, as most people in the audience probably realize, since I'm in the criminal division, and for the past 3 weeks, there have been protests and other incidents that have taken place. Some of these protesters may have been charged with trespass. They may have been charged with destruction of private property or failure to follow a court order. If someone from the audience should ask a question that pertains to a particular case, ethically, I could not answer that question. I'm going to ask one other thing, Reggie, is am I being seen by the audience, because my screen has gone blank?
Yes, sir, you are being seen, and you look very handsome.
Okay, well, thank you, because all I'm seeing is Zoom across the screen.
Okay, well, rest assured, we can see you and we can hear you. Thank you, Judge. I'd like to invite State Representative Carrie Tipper to introduce herself.
Hi there, good evening. I'm just thrilled to be here today on this panel. It's obviously been a heavy, I would say 3 weeks, but it's like 400 years. So, but just really looking forward to this conversation today. My background is I was born here in Denver. My mother's Costa Rican. We went back to Costa Rica. She studied in Mexico. So as a little girl, I grew up in Costa Rica and Mexico. And then we came back to Colorado and settled in Lakewood. So for me, I'm a state representative representing sort of the town that I grew up in once we moved to Colorado. As a lawyer, I started out my practice in Boston and worked at a firm and then moved to the Attorney General's office in Mass, where I was prosecuting civil rights cases, anti-discrimination law and civil rights law violations. So from there, I transitioned to the Attorney General's office here in Colorado when we decided to move back here, and never ever saw myself running for office, but was personally very compelled after the 2016 elections, and felt like I can either sit on the sidelines and be pissed off, to be honest, or I can get involved and do what I can to try and be some of the change that I wish I had seen. So I was elected in 2018, just finished serving my first term in the Colorado House of Representatives and gearing up for re-election. But really I'm thrilled to be here. I think, you know, particularly as a lawyer, and I know we have mostly lawyers listening today, there were sort of two lights of hope this last week that we saw from the Supreme Court that kind of reinvigorated me personally with the, you know, Title VII ruling and then today's decision on DACA. So I'm really excited to be here, looking forward to the conversation, and just grateful to be on this panel of incredible advocates.
Well, thank you, Carrie. And as somebody who's been to Costa Rica 5 times, including my anniversary with my wife, I say pura vida.
Excellent.
All right, next up we have Tyrone Glover, a trial lawyer. Hello, Tyrone.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good.
So my name is Tyrone Glover. I'm a trial lawyer here in Denver. My practice is primarily civil rights law and criminal defense. So when the government violates your civil rights, whether it's Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, First Amendment, I sue them in federal court. So this topic and much of what's been going on the last several weeks is very near and dear to me, because when there are excessive force cases, I'm the lawyer suing the police. On the other side, I also do criminal defense work. I was a public defender, and I'm in my best suit today because I feel like I'm in the judge's courtroom. I appeared in Denver County Court when I cut my teeth as a young public defender in the same courtrooms where Judge Jackson is currently practicing. And so that's my practice. I'm originally from California. I came out here in 2005 to go to CU Law School and stayed ever since. Tried to stay very involved in the community, not only with my practice, but also in following a lot of what's going on in the policy. There was a great policy victory that we had last week, and also involved in my bar associations. I've been a member of the Sam Carey Bar Association, of which Judge Jackson is a founder, since I moved to Colorado, and I'm the incoming president of the Denver Bar Association. Really looking forward to some of the dialogue here today. I remember going, it's sponsored by the Symposium for Race, and I remember going to some of the first symposiums years ago, and I was just encouraged by the boldness and the courage, behind some of the conversations there. And I just think that they've probably grown, and the conversations we're hearing around all of this these days, and the reason why I'm thinking things are changing the way they are, is we're just having some really good, bold, sophisticated conversations. So I'm excited to keep more of that going in the next hour and a half.
Very good. And he didn't mention that he's also a black belt and undefeated mixed martial artist in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So when you say stay 6 feet away from this guy, you mean stay 6 feet away from him.
Don't worry, we're all virtual, Reggie. We're fine.
All right, now a young man who is a current law student, Chris Martin, apparently didn't have the grades to get into Texas State, which is my alma mater, but he's over, I don't know, some trade school here in Denver. You want to tell us about it?
Absolutely. Good evening. Thank you again for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure to be a part of it. And I'm really excited for the conversations we're about to have over the next hour and a half. So my name is Chris Martin. I'm a rising 3 at the University of Denver Stern College of Law. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico in a biracial home. My dad is Black from New Jersey. My mom is Mexican from New Mexico. I have since continued up I-25 where I went to undergrad at Colorado College, where I studied economics, minored in Spanish, and wrote my senior thesis on incarceration rate disparity and the contributing factors to that disparity, which beginning my sophomore year was what initially sparked my interest in law. After that first project I did, second semester sophomore year, almost every single bit of research I did was geared towards incarceration rate disparities and understanding what contributed to that. And that's really what ultimately helped me make my decision to decide to pursue law school. While at Colorado College, I also had the unique opportunity to play 4 years of college basketball, where I served as captain for 2 of those years and was an undersized center for also those 2 years. So I love a good fight. After having spent 4 years at Colorado College, I knew that I wanted to remain in Colorado, and I decided to apply to law school and knew Denver was just where I wanted to be. However, I think I'll stop my journey northward on I-25 here in Denver, and really, again, excited to be a part of this panel with such an amazing group of people.
Thank you, Chris. How tall are you?
We'll call it 6'5" on the roster on a good day.
Okay.
6'4" officially.
With the right shoes, right?
Is an undersized center. Okay, I got you. All right. And finally, we have the woman who has organized all of this. She is the CEO of CLI. Please welcome Ms. Sarah Scott.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to our awesome panelists for being here today and for sharing their time and their incredibly busy schedules. And thank you to Reggie Rivers for moderating us. It's sure to be a very interesting and dynamic conversation. I'm thrilled to be the CEO of CLI. I began in this post on April 27th, 2020, so a few months ago. Prior to that, I was in private practice for 10 years. And I started my career 5 years prior to that at the Children's Law Center in DC. So I practiced for a total of 15 years before taking on a job where I'm not really a practicing attorney anymore, but I'm loving it nevertheless. I am from Denver. I went to law school back east in Washington, DC, and I was never moving home. I said that over and over again. But then you have a baby late in life and your father becomes terminally ill and things change. So I'm thrilled to be back home, close to where I went to high school at East High School, and just really looking forward to this conversation and want to just thank all the panelists and thank you all for all the viewers for signing up and really making this important conversation one that is going to be long lasting.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for organizing this. And thank you to our sponsor, Symposium on Race. Thank you to our partners. There are 6 bar associations that partner with CLI, the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of Colorado, the Colorado Hispanic Bar Association, the Colorado Women's Bar Association, LGBT Bar Association, Sam Carey Bar Association, and the South Asian Bar Association of Colorado. We appreciate all of your commitment and support of this organization and this event. And I want to lead off the conversation with just kind of a current state of what's happening in our nation and how do we get there. And I'm going to hand that to you, Tyrone, to kind of lead us off here with your thoughts about what's happening in our country.
Yeah, I think we are at this point where a confluence of factors have really, I think, set us up well for some real meaningful change. I think a number of things have happened when it comes to police violence. We unfortunately, because of cell phones and body cameras, have essentially a highlight reel of so much of the type of conduct that Black folks have been telling everyone about for decades. It's now in high definition, and it's now in the forefront of the national consciousness. We also have people having, I think, bold and brave conversations about race on a deeper level. Conversations not just about hate, but actually about systematic racism, about white privilege, about white fragility. I'm surprised at this point in time, the dialogue I'm having with people, it's just on a much more deep, sophisticated level. We're not starting at zero with everyone. you know, our allies in this space are almost at the point where they're like, what can we do? We get it. What can we do? And then I think, you know, through this pandemic, it's caused, you know, people to become a little more introspective. It's one thing to be learning about what's going on around you and what's going on with your neighbor. It's another thing, you know, if you're sort of forced to be at home and you look within yourself and you have to sort of reckon with what part you may have played in all of this and what you can do going forward, right? And I think people, right when all of this started to happen, were sort of had taken inventory and were ready to do something. And then when that opportunity presented itself, you saw the passions of the people inflame, and you saw things actually start to get done. So I think that's sort of where we are. We're at this a bit of a tipping point where we have a number of factors that have come together, and we're actually starting to see progress. And I think it's imperative on us as lawyers, as the social engineers of our communities, to make sure that we don't lose that momentum. We've had some good victories, but oftentimes what happens with those good victories is everyone chills out, you know, they go to the after party, they're hanging out in the locker room, and they're sort of taking a deep breath. We got to keep pushing forward. We've got some real big challenges ahead of us, and we can't slow down. We can't take our foot off the gas pedal.
Okay. And Sarah, I want to push that to you in thinking about those victories and that momentum. How do we take the protests that are happening right now and turn them into action that will make change?
Sure, I think that's a great question. One of the things that we certainly want to do is to properly mourn where we are in this country. Yes, we are at a place of incredible opportunity and at a place where we can actually see some systemic change. But at the same time, the price has been incredibly high, and it's been incredibly high for the Black community. And I think we need to stop and make sure that we pay homage to that and that we properly mourn those who have fallen and have been murdered by reckless police officers, or those who are not on duty. I believe that we do have a lot to look forward to. I also don't want protests to turn into parades, and I want us to make sure that we are really moving forward on a basis that is very clear cut, and that the agendas that we come up with, we make sure that they are followed through. I don't think that there is any going back to Tyrone's point about COVID-19. During COVID-19, we saw that Brown and Black people were the most affected, and that most of the deaths occurred. There were Brown and Black people who were dying. And then sort of on the heels of that, we see all that happened with Mr. Floyd. I would like to basically put forth the idea that there are really two pandemics going on. We have the pandemic of COVID-19, and we also have the very real pandemic of racial violence and police brutality in the state of America. I am very much looking forward to seeing what we're going to do. I am thrilled to see what already has been done. I look at states like New York and see what the governor is doing there, how he has given each county until April 1st, essentially 9 months, to come up with their own design for their police force in their respective counties, and understanding that counties will have different needs, and a calling to those counties to get everybody at the table and to really come up with what's best for that community. I think that's a great example. I hope that that's something that Colorado considers. And it's our time. I mean, it's a time of racial reckoning. One of the things that is absolutely true, and I have had many conversations with my white friends who are asking me what to do. And it's not only my white friends, it's other people of color who may not be Black, but are saying, we want to be there. We want to be there for you. We want to be there for the community. What can we do? And I know we're going to talk about allyship a little bit later. And I won't go too far into this question, but the number one thing that we can do now is certainly understand the historical context in which we find ourselves in as a very important part to moving forward.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And Judge Jackson, I want to go to you on the topic of white privilege, that so much of what we see happening in our community feels to us like the result of white privilege. But when we talk to our white friends about that, they say, well, what do you mean? What do you mean about privilege? Can you expand on white privilege?
Well, Reggie, when I think of the term white privilege, I basically look at it that white people have had a 400-year head start on black people. I look at it from the point of view that economically and educationally, white people have had those advantages 400 more years than we have had. I look at white privilege as basically unearned privileges given to white people solely because of skin color. I think about my relatives who were enslaved. When they were released from the South, they owned nothing. They had no property. They had no savings. So these are the privileges that white people have gained over centuries. And so I also, when we talk about white privileges, I think if we talk in concrete terms, and if you don't mind me using an example, when I graduated from CU Law School in 1970, there were no associate positions available to me at the big 5 law firms. Those big 5 law firms, and I think we all know who they are, Sherman and Howard. It was Home Roberts and Owens at the time, Holland and Hart, Davis, Graham and Stubbs, Rothgerber, Apple, and Powers. Now, if they were going to hire a person of color back in the early 70s, the person of color had to have graduated from Harvard, Yale, University of California at Berkeley. They were not hiring a person like me who had graduated from the University of Colorado. Therefore, I ended up at the Denver District Attorney's Office. So that to me is another example of white privilege, where white graduates in my class had opportunities at certain law firms that were not available to me. Another example of what I consider to be white privileges. Black lawyers didn't become eligible for being a judge in Colorado until 1957. 1957 was when we had our first African-American judge selected by a mayor. That was Judge Flanagan. Judge Flanagan is the person who my courthouse is named after. I'm honored to work in this courtroom that bears his name. But Judge Flanagan, who was the grandson of a slave, was the first judge of color, and I'm talking about Black, Latino, Asian, in Colorado in 1957. So you think that is almost 100 years after slavery was over. I also look in terms of another concrete example of white privilege. It wasn't until 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, that throughout the nation, people of color could go to their home law schools. Thurgood Marshall, our first Black Supreme Court justice, could not attend the University of Maryland because of segregation and de facto laws that prevented him from attending his own university. Another aspect of what I consider to be white privilege, my dad, who was a master sergeant in World War II, fought in Europe and North Africa, received 3 Bronze Stars, but did not get the benefit that other white soldiers got of the GI Bill. So when my dad bought his first home in 1955, he had to purchase that home through a Black lending institution. So what I'm giving you are examples of what I consider to be white privilege that are personal to me. My dad, who was born and raised in Missouri, in the segregated South, did not learn how to drive until he came to Colorado after World War II, because he couldn't get a driver's license in Missouri. These are the privileges and the advantages that white people received that Black people are still attempting to obtain. So that's my concrete definition of white privilege.
Gotcha. Thank you. And those are great examples from your life. But if I think we could look in the lives of all the Black people in this country and find similar examples of their ancestors. I want to go to Representative Tipper with kind of a dual question. One, continuing the thoughts about white privilege and how that plays out. And two, kind of piggybacking on something Sarah mentioned about the governor of New York giving all the municipalities 9 months to make changes in their police. And so I wonder if you could weigh in on both of those things as far as it relates to Colorado.
Yeah, and just kind of the way that I've been thinking about this, I mean, and you take a look at me and my existence has been very different than most of our panelists here. But something Sarah said also resonated with me, talking about within the Latin community. I mean, we have a tremendous amount of classism and colorism, and then between Latino populations and the Black community, there's been a sometimes frankly competing dynamic there. So this time has also, I think, forced a lot of us, particularly in the Latino community, to have really difficult conversations about how we look at race and how we how we internalize racism and the things that we've been doing. And some of the conversations I've been having with folks around white privilege have been, the way that I think about this is white privilege is sort of the absence of fear. Like, you go about your day doing your thing, you get pulled over, you don't worry about it. You go into work, you show up at work wearing what you want to wear, having your hair however you want to have it, and you don't worry about anyone saying or doing anything, or when you're walking down the street that someone's going to say something to you. And I think what can be difficult is people that don't experience that and have never experienced it, it's sort of inconceivable for them that other people are treated like this on a daily basis. So that's the only thing that I would add in terms of the way that I think a little bit about white privilege and what it means. And this kind of manifested itself in a conversation I had with my neighbor actually the other day. And he was saying to me, Carrie, you're a lawyer. I just wanted to talk to you. My son was speeding. He got caught 25 miles per hour over the speed limit. And the cop gave him a ticket for going 90 in a 65. And I really think he should have given him 89. And I just wanted to explode. And he was saying, he should have told him. And I thought, what is wrong with you? And we talked a little bit earlier about sort of the rage that you feel. And I actually did say to him, I said, you're lucky your son's not Black. And that stopped the conversation. But an example, again, of just this indignation that he had without even an awareness of like what we're talking about right now, Going to your second question, Sarah mentioned New York. So we just wrapped up the legislative session on Monday, and it was a bit of a whirlwind. I wish I shared the optimism that there's no turning back. I think that we have to be really cognizant and really forceful, because I do fear that, for example, we just passed pretty broad sweeping legislation in Colorado. Frankly, we're leading the nation with Senate Bill 217. The Police Integrity and Accountability Act, which had a lot of components, everything from requiring body cams to getting rid of the fleeing felon. So no longer can you shoot someone in the back when they pose no imminent threat to you. Reforming use of force. I mean, a lot of components. And we had to leverage, frankly, crudely, George Floyd's death to do this. All of these components we had in this bill have been proposed pieces of legislation that didn't stand a chance to go anywhere until 3 weeks ago. And my worry is people will say, we did what we needed to do, everything's fine now. And we just know that's not the case. I mean, Judge Jackson went through, some examples of broad systematic issues that we have, not just in Colorado, but across the country. And so we really need to be driving what are bold but really humane policy changes, not just in our state, but across the country. So on the one hand, I am proud of Colorado and what we were able to do, but I'm also very cognizant that we had a short window to do that. And I think people are going to point to that and say, like, we already did a lot. We don't need to do any more. When we need change, education, health, I mean, you name it, we need policy changes. So I'm going to stay optimistic, but we, I think, need pressure from the outside to keep people accountable, to keep lawmakers accountable so that they're pushing these policies that are long overdue.
Thank you very much, Carrie. That's very good. And I want to go to Chris, who's our current law student. And Chris, given your background in writing a thesis about incarceration and the racial disparities in incarceration, I'm curious to see your perception on what's happening right now in our country, because this definitely seems like a tipping point on an issue that is, the police part of it, the incarceration has like decades old of this increase. What do you think about what's happening now?
I mean, I really think this is, like Representative Tipper said, this is the point at which we can use this momentum to really create long-lasting change. But this isn't a new issue. I remember growing up, and my dad was born in 1950 and went through the riots when he was in New Jersey. Like, this has been a part of my upbringing, learning about this day in and day out, and having my parents give me the talk at like 9 and 10 years old, like, don't upset police officers. We want you to come home at night. Or if I'm walking in a neighborhood where I don't belong, right? It's something that weighs on your mind and in your existence day to day. So seeing what's happening now, it's encouraging, and I'm really optimistic. Like, I'm seeing people step up across the board, whether that be through social media, through donations, through just general awareness in ways that no one has before. But I also, again, am cautious, again, echoing what Representative Tipper said, in that I just hope it doesn't fade, because as the headlines tend to fade, people tend to forget about it. There's always going to be a new crisis, hopefully not a new pandemic, but there's always going to be a new crisis, a new something coming up that will end up swallowing the headlines from before. So my hope is that we don't let this pass us by. We don't let this momentum fade. And while some people might not be as vocal in their support, I hope the willingness and the desire to continue to have these conversations, to continue to make these changes, and to continue to increase our awareness stays. So I think it's a good point. It's a really pivotal time in history. And I'm encouraged and cautious. Cautiously optimistic, I think, is a better way of phrasing it. And, again, kind of like I said, it's been building up for a while. We've seen this incarceration throughout history. We've seen police brutality throughout history. It's just now being documented. And the statistics will point at the fact that, sure, maybe blacks and whites are killed at the same amount as each other, but when we look at population demographics, there's a huge disparity. Same with incarceration rates. And when we consider that, I think it really paints a new picture that maybe isn't as widely distributed as could be. And the more aware people are of that, the more we see a problem that really needs to be addressed and needs to be changed.
Thank you, Chris. You give us hope for the future of our young lawyers. Very well said. And I want to make just a quick comment. I published a column in the Denver Post on Sunday. Where basically it was talking about how I am a Rottweiler in our society. As a black man, I'm a Rottweiler. People are afraid of me on first sight. When I'm walking down the sidewalk and I see people coming in my direction, I can see that they make a determination. Do they think it's safe to walk past me? When the elevator doors open up and I'm standing there, people have this instant flinch where they're trying to decide, is it safe for me to enter? And that's every part of my life. And when I go to the park, when I'm at the store, when I'm wherever I am, I'm seen as a dangerous creature in our society. And it's hard for my white friends to understand that, because they're Labrador retrievers. As Labrador retrievers, they're accepted everywhere. They go into every store. They are welcome in every house, in every park. It's not a Labrador retriever off leash catching a Frisbee is almost invisible. A Rottweiler off leash just standing there is such a threat that somebody is likely to call the police about it. And so for me, trying to explain systemic racism, I felt that this analogy was a simple way to get to see that the Rottweiler's path through life is very different than a Labrador retriever. And the Labrador retriever believes that if you're just kind and you wag your tail a lot, then everyone will like you and you'll be accepted everywhere. It's not really recognized in reality. It doesn't matter how friendly the Rottweiler is. It doesn't matter how much I wag my tail. I am still this dangerous entity. They might say, oh, he's a friendly Rottweiler, but most of them aren't. There's that. That's the stigma that is in our society. And so it's in the Denver Post, a column that I wrote. But I wanted to swing back around to you, Tyrone, and as a trial lawyer who tries instances of people's civil rights being violated, what are you seeing in terms of how what's happening right now might change the way these cases are prosecuted in the future?
And right now, there's no officer accountability, right? The instances of officers being criminally charged is rare. I mean, there was just an announcement just hours ago that the officer involved in a shooting is not being charged. And their other fellow officers are not going to testify against them. Hopefully that's a trend that's reversing. I think that there was one of the recent cases, there actually is an officer cooperating against his fellow officer, and so no longer letting these quote bad apples sort of go without accountability. But in the instance when they aren't charged criminally, what oftentimes happens is they're sued civilly by lawyers like me. And there was what we called qualified immunity, right? So essentially us, the taxpayers, if they were sued and if the city settles or there's a verdict, right, to indemnify the person who'd been wronged, then the taxpayers would pay for it. And the officer would have qualified immunity and would not be on the hook for anything. It's my understanding, and Representative Tipper, you can maybe tell me what the number ended up as. It was, I think, 10% going into the bill. I think it's less, but it's not anything insignificant. But now officers can be potentially on the hook. It's not such a large percentage that now wronged folks are not going to get paid, but it gives them enough skin in the game. And then when you have a couple of officers in your precinct or in your department who've had to pay out large civil verdicts because of their conduct, and it doesn't always have to be fatal, right? We have lots of instances of just excessive force where they're pulling out their tasers or, they're hitting people with their batons. A few good, solid civil judgments against officers, maybe we'll start to finally see a change in sort of the officer culture in some of these precincts. But I think at the end of the day, while I really do applaud our lawmakers for the reform that just recently went through, I think there needs to be broader and even more sweeping ground up change and just an overall reevaluation of what it means to protect and serve our communities and what policing and the role of policing plays in that role.
Judge Jackson, I want to ask you, what role does the judiciary play in trying to make a change in this area?
Well, I think from my perspective, and let me just start with most of maybe the people in the audience know that I had a personal call to action back in October of 2018, because we were at the point in 2018 where Judge Bill Robbins was retiring from the Denver District Court. Upon his retirement, if he had not been replaced by another Black judge, there would have been 0 Black district court judges in the state. And that's out of 181 judges. A few months later, Karen Ashby, Judge Karen Ashby on the Court of Appeals, was announcing her retirement. Upon her leaving, it left 0 African-American judges on the Colorado Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. So that's 0 out of 29. So I had a personal call to action back in October of 2018 to try and enlist allies, coalition partners, individuals, trial lawyer organizations who felt that it was important to have a diverse bench. The importance of a diverse bench is that it, first of all, it provides confidence to people when they come into court, whether they are witnesses, whether or not they're citizens as jurors, whether or not they're lawyers, or whether or not they're just parties to a lawsuit. So we want to have a bench that is diverse. As judges in criminal cases, we make decisions regarding probable cause, whether or not somebody should be arrested. We make decisions regarding whether or not there is probable cause to issue a search warrant. It's my feeling that with a diverse bench, you get better decisions because you have more life experiences that diverse people have in making those types of decisions. You make decisions whether or not certain evidence should be admissible into court. So as the judiciary, in order for the judiciary to be respected, we need to have a judiciary that is diverse. So that has been my pledge, that has been my passion for the last 2 years. And with what has taken place with the Floyd incident, the incident just recently last weekend in Atlanta, I think the population is understanding why there is the need for both changes within the police system, but changes within the court system so that the court system reflects the citizens that come into court.
Very good. Thank you, Judge. And I want to go back to Sarah to talk about the death of Mr. Floyd. And, you know, we tend to, in these situations, we tend to look and we say, what did that individual suspect do that caused the police to react that way? Or what did that bad police officer do that was a violation of the law? And we tend to isolate it down to that incident and those two people. But really, it's privilege and this history of racism and systemic racism that killed George Floyd. The officer was just the tool or the mechanism that made it happen. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Sarah?
You know, I do. And in talking about it, I mean, I want to convey that the murder of George Floyd may at first appear tangential to the work that we do at CLI as it relates to diversity and inclusivity, but in fact, it falls squarely within our work, right? So you have this murder based on stereotypes, not based on who George Floyd was as an individual, that he had lost a job, that he was in Minnesota to be an essential worker, that after losing his job, he had didn't have any sick leave, and he was just trying to make ends meet. So we don't look at him as an individual, as a family member, as a member of his community, but instead we lump them all together in a stereotypical manner as another Black man trying to cause trouble or, trying to, I don't know, in a way, talk back to the police, right? Which was absolutely not the case here, but I'm just sort of generalizing. But here's the thing, is that every time we don't look at people as inclusive beings, but we look at them as based on the stereotypes, the old stereotypes that we have about them, we are really missing the boat, and we are really exerting our white privilege because we are not doing what we need to do to be inclusive. We are not doing what we need to do to make sure that diversity is something that, is not just like a catchphrase, right? And there's a direct relationship, like I said, between what happened with Mr. Floyd and the fact that there's very few Black law students at DU and CU, and the fact that there's very few lawyers in the country, and the fact that there's very few Black partners in the Denver law firms, the fact that there's very few Black associates at Denver law firms, also in the AG's office, also in the PD's office. All of this is around stereotyping. All of this is based on white privilege. It's the same white privilege, right? And let us be crystal clear that this isn't just about police brutality in the Black community. It's about all of the systems, right? The numbers as it relates to poverty in the Black community. The last statistics I heard was that 61% of Black people live in poverty, which is just astonishing. And if you look at all of the debates since the 2016 elections, not one of them was about poverty. And we have to look at how all of these systems work together to create additional disenfranchisement and disconnect. So we're looking at the legislation, we're looking at policies that don't fit the inclusive approach that we need to be talking about as it relates to healthcare. You know, when we saw, and which we will continue to see, COVID-19, the deaths of Black and Brown people, there wasn't a change in health policy when that happened. When we look at education, we need to get education right for there to be real change among the Black community. We need to get our economics right and our jobs right and our employment numbers right. And so there's so much tied into this. And once we peel away and get to the heart of white privilege, what that really means, and people understand the context from which Black people are talking about and living from, then we can start to have conversations about diversity and inclusivity as a way to build up and build back our communities. So that's what I would say.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And Representative Tipper, coming back to you on the subject of systems. I mean, one of the, people will say, well, you can't legislate racism away. But I think history kind of shows that they certainly legislated racism into our government and into our systems. What role can the legislature play in legislating racism out of our systems so that even though you might not be able to root it out of somebody's mind, you can take it out of the government processes?
Yeah, I mean, going back to a little bit of what Tyrone talked about, so the qualified immunity piece, I actually think one of the most damning parts of qualified immunity was not just that police officers weren't personally on the hook, but that you didn't even get to liability. It completely blocked access to the courts. So when we talk about a community's trust in law enforcement, to literally see people being murdered, beat within an inch of their life, and not have any accountability, I mean, how can we have any trust in law enforcement that serves and protects when there are no consequences? So one of the things that 217 did was it removed qualified immunity. That's a step. It's a tiny, teeny step. But I think there are tremendous areas in policy that we can look at. So everything from enhancing anti-discrimination laws here in the state, which we did a little bit of that today, but really I think, and I don't remember if it was Chris or Tyrone that mentioned this, it's more about, I think, dismantling systems. So when we're talking about funding, you see this conversation nationally, but when we're talking about funding police at the rate that we fund them at, and we're taking out of Head Start, early education, we're taking out of health disparity studies, we're taking out of investments in, professional boards and really moving, accelerating, people of community up where they should have been long, long ago, then we won't see change. So for me, I think, number one of the most important things is, and Judge Jackson talked about this, it matters who's on the bench, it matters who's your representative, it matters who's your senator and what they look like and what their life experience is like. So frankly, we haven't had a lot of change because up until recently, the legislature was, and it continues to be majority white, but it was overwhelmingly white. We now have the largest Latino caucus that we've ever had and the largest Black caucus. So having representatives from communities in the decision-making parts of the room, and none of this is novel, I think, folks I think that are interested or that are paying attention to this know this, but what I will say is it's not just your state elected officials that matter. Every level of government matters. I'm not even kidding. Your water board, we've got a coup happening in Lakewood on a water board. Tay Anderson has proven himself to be a tremendous, bold leader in Denver Public Schools. He's the youngest elected official, and here he is driving huge changes. So all of those things matter. We need people to pay attention, but also push candidates to be bold in the policies that they make. So I think the answer is long and complex, but we need folks who are sick of status quo and ready to push new ideas.
Yeah, long and complex, but not impossible. We're a nation who's done many things that seemed impossible and seemed difficult. We take on big challenges when we want to. One of them, Chris, coming back to you, the Black Lives Matter movement, where Black people are basically saying, hey, we just want to say that we matter. I think it was a comedian on Saturday Night Live. Who's the Black comedian who does Weekend Update? Oh, gosh.
Michael Shea?
Yeah, Mike, thank you. He said we're not even saying that Black lives are important. We're just saying Black lives matter, like that very basic level of acceptance in our society. But the counter to that often is, well, all lives matter. And we're certainly not saying that all lives don't matter, but why is it important, Chris, in your mind, for the distinction that Black lives matter?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And before I continue, I'd really like to backtrack real quick to one point on privilege. Just one thing I really want to add. It's like, just privilege doesn't necessarily mean your life hasn't been harder, that you face more difficulty than others. It just means that your life hasn't been made more difficult by the color of your skin. You're not conscious of your own existence 24/7. You're not aware of how people perceive you. You don't walk into an interview room, for example, and know that they're seeing you first for what you look like as opposed to the credentials on the paper. You're not raised that it's not good enough to be as good as your white peers, but you have to be better to just have a fair shot. So now going to your question on Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, in my experience, I've just noticed a trend that I don't really hear a whole lot of All Lives Matter rally cries when there's no cries for Black Lives Matter. It just seems that those two go hand in hand almost. And I really think that All Lives Matter detracts from Black Lives Matter. And I'd like to just make a couple of brief analogies just because I think they really help illustrate the point. For example, if you have a house on fire in a neighborhood, you're going to put water on that one house. You're not going to douse the whole neighborhood in water. That would be stupid because there's people in danger in that one house. You're not going to go to a rally for one specific disease and then be the one chanting, well, all diseases matter. We need all cures for all diseases. Yeah, that's important. But the one that is most urgent right now is that one disease you're rallying for. You're not going to be in the waiting room in the hospital and have someone with life-threatening injuries on one seat about to die at any minute and someone else who needs a couple stitches in the other and take that person back first. It's urgency. So here we have the Black community that, while considering all people is important, right now the urgency lies with Black Americans in the Black community, and we need to be okay with that. Just as you wouldn't spray all houses with water when only one's on fire because people in danger, you wouldn't neglect one people group in favor of all others. And those of you listening who know my religious beliefs, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to take it biblical and say, we have not leaving the 99 to pursue the one. Well, right now that one is the Black community, and that's why, yes, all lives are important, all lives matter, but here the focus, the sense of urgency and the importance of this lies with Black lives, and why we need to focus and embrace the Black Lives Matter movement and help be allies.
Very well said. Thank you. Tyrone, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, those analogies are great. And I do feel like people understand more these days. We definitely got the all lives matter sort of reactions when people would say Black Lives Matter. And I think when we're getting it these days, it's more people who, are trying to use it as a way to sort of dog whistle or almost diminish or take power away from the movement. But the people whose hearts are really in the right place, at least to begin with, understand when we say Black Lives Matter, that all lives matter. But the real all lives matter challenges these days are sort of pointing out to people when they're being all lives matter by not saying things like recognizing that, the brutality from police is against Black bodies, right? Where poverty isn't just sort of, there are poor people and they're in impoverished neighborhoods all over this country, but systematic racial poverty affects Black folks. And you have these shortages and voids in healthcare and education and mental health and these disparities in incarceration because of this systematic poverty. And what you do still see now is, sometimes in some of the language and some of the press releases and some of even statements of solidarity, they get a bit whitewashed and they sort of are afraid to go all the way and say Black Lives Matter. And so while I think we're hearing less of the, Black Lives Matter and then someone says all lives matter back to us, I still do think we have some work to do to make sure that when people are trying to pitch in and help out in this space, that they aren't watering down the message, right? That they're not sort of defaulting into things that just feel good, that aren't actually actionable and help, right? I think Sarah said this is a protest, not a parade. right? And I think that sort of co-opting of the messaging and making it more palatable, and I think less forceful and less actionable is a bit of a sort of subverted all lives matter. And that's really the next battlefront to making sure that Black lives continue to matter in this movement.
Thank you, Tyrone. And you mentioned, I wanted to switch over into allyship, but please, Carrie, go ahead and make your comment. And then I want to hear your thoughts about how people can be an ally to the Black community at this time.
Well, I was going to say, I'll throw a little fire on the flame. To me, actually, and I've confessed to you all earlier that I've had some rage in my heart the last 3 weeks, especially at the legislature. When someone says all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, that's to me like them saying, no, they don't. It's, I heard an analogy that it was like a mom of kids and the youngest says, Mom, do you love me? And she says, I love all of my kids. It's like, you're not answering the question. And that's really what it is. It's posing this idea that like validate this very basic concept and people refusing to do it. So maybe I'm just like jaded from the session, but going to your question about allyship, and again, like this is something I've thought a lot about, and how do I be a good ally? How do I confront my demons? How do I come to terms with my racism? Because part of the big issue is, and we saw this on the floor in the debate, people are unwilling to accept their internalized, biases, their racism, and we can't move anywhere. We can't progress unless people confront those, confront those feelings, those terms, and deal with them. One example, one of the members of our Black caucus spoke about, her experience as a mother and telling her kids, these are the things you need to do when a police officer, pulls you over, put your hands on the steering wheel, be respectful. And some of the white male members of the legislature were nodding their heads like, oh, we tell our kids that. And I'm thinking, you're missing the point. You might tell your kids that because it's a sign of respect, but Representative Buckner tells her kids that because she's worried they won't come home. And they're two completely different things. So to me, allyship, one, is educating yourself. Do the work to understand what you're dealing with internally, but also the broader context that you have had no idea about or have had very little interaction with. And Reggie, I loved your piece about the Black Labs and Rottweilers, because I think that's a really great analogy. I mean, you've got sort of slobbering, dog wagging Black Labs that are just completely oblivious of everything going around them, meanwhile the injustices that we see happening. So to me, that's one of the most important pieces. And then listening, yes, is obviously like incredibly important. What it is, when you ask someone, how can I help you? How can I be helpful? Listen to what they're saying. But there's a fine line too, because it's not their job to educate you. And that's where I think, going back to the first point, you need to take on the responsibility of educating yourself. So when someone tells you a story, you don't react with shock and awe, because that's also demoralizing and demeaning, because it means you've completely missed, again, the point.
Right. Sarah, do you want to weigh in on more on kind of what it means to be an ally? I mean, that's one of the major topics of this conversation we're having today.
Yeah, it is. So first I want to start by saying that not all Black people want to have a discussion about allyship. And so I know that me and a lot of my colleagues and a lot of my friends, we've gotten phone calls from our white colleagues and friends and asking them what we should do. Well, the Black community seems to be split to me. Half of us want to engage in a conversation about what it means to be an ally, and the other half of us want to say, go do your homework and come back and talk to me after you've done your homework, right? Us at CLI, we are happy to engage in every and any conversation, so long it's coming from a place of really wanting to learn and really wanting to be an ally. I think that to be an ally, you have to have two things. You have to have empathy, and you have to have an ability to learn and relearn. And I think that can be really, really difficult. I think it can be hard when I, for example, am telling one of my girlfriends last fall how implicit bias happened to me that day when I was exhausted and went to pick up my son at his kindergarten, and I was pulled aside by the principal of the school after being up for many days in a row. My paralegal had just quit, long story. Woe is I. But anyway, it was a very difficult time in my life, and I was brought aside by the head of the school, and I was asked if I was okay. And at that moment, I could not just be a mom. I could not just be a lawyer who was having a bad day. I could not just be someone who was trying to pick up her child from daycare. I went right into, I'm a Black person, I'm a Black mother. I have to prove to her that I'm okay to get my son. Otherwise, she's going to call whoever it is that she's going to call, and it's not going to look good. And I have to go into lawyer mode also and start writing down everything that she says. And that is the implicit bias. It's so incredibly nuanced, and for white people to understand that that is implicit bias, and it's the experience of the person of color that matters. A non-person of color cannot argue that people of color have the experiences that they do, and so they're going to have to be empathetic to that and to be willing to learn, but again, to relearn so many things that they thought they previously knew. One of the things, are we going to talk about color blindness later, Reggie?
Sure, yeah, we'll come back to it because I'd like to get the judge and Chris to weigh in on allyship as well.
Okay, so yeah, let me just stop there then.
Okay, and we'll start with you, Judge Jackson, about how is it that people can be an ally to the Black community?
Well, I think that first of all, you've got to lift your voice. Silence, and this is a phrase that my wife uses all the time, silence is violence. And so if you don't lift your voice, if you don't speak out, if you allow the status quo to remain, then you're not being an ally. An ally is that voice. It's that taking some type of action in the workplace that is going to make a difference for someone of color that may not have the same advantage, may not have the same privilege that is being stereotyped. And it is all the different people who have the opportunity to speak out, take whatever action they can take on an individual basis. That's what I consider to be an ally. And it's as simple as that. Speak out. Don't allow the status quo. And the status quo is what has created the different barriers that we are now being confronted with. So yeah, that's how I look at an ally for me.
That's great. And I'm going to come to you, Chris. I want to make one quick comment. I started thinking about white privilege by thinking about my own privilege and saying, I'm a man. What are the privileges that I have, and in what ways does being a man make my path through the world a little bit easier? And one of the ways I noticed it immediately when I started to look at it was that I would be in meetings, and like in a corporate setting, 12 people around a table, 7 men, 5 women. And if I raised my hand and said, hey, I've got an idea, I've got something I want to share, and it took me 60 seconds to get my thought out, I was reasonably confident no one was going to interrupt me for that 60 seconds. I would get that full time. And then I started, when a woman would raise her hand and say, hey, I have an idea, I started mentally counting in my head, and invariably within 15 or 20 seconds, someone would interrupt. It might not be a full interruption to completely derail her, but they would start to interrupt and make comments and do things that would diminish her ability to finish making her thought. And I started to recognize that's part of my privilege as a man. And so how can I react to that? When I see it happen, maybe I can say, hey, wait a second, I'd like to hear the rest of what Lori had to say right there, and to just give her back the platform in the moment. And I think for all of us, if we start looking at the ways in which we are privileged, we can notice how that makes our path easier in life and how difficult it is for somebody who doesn't share that same privilege with us. And Chris, I want to get your thoughts about allyship, and how people can be an ally to the Black community?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest thing, kind of echoing what Sarah said, is empathy. And people who want to be allies have to be willing to get uncomfortable. They have to be willing to have these tough conversations. They have to be willing to see things from a perspective that's not their own and step into the shoes of someone else who's going through it when they really haven't experienced that. And I'm going to echo again what one of my pastors said in our recent series about two different postures of approaching this, right? We have a posture of guilt, which is, oh, it's not to do it. This wasn't on me, so why do I get the blame for it? Whereas a posture of grief is, I'm so sorry, I grieve with you, you're hurting, like how can I help? So the posture of guilt is self-centered. It puts the focus on you, it builds walls, and it takes everyone else out of the equation and makes it about how you feel. On the other hand, we have this posture of grief where someone else is hurting. One member of the community is hurting, everyone's hurting, and you hurt with them. That posture of grief makes it more collaborative. It makes people willing to have these discussions, empathize, and understand what people are going through, and hopefully use that feelings and that understanding to make change. Instead of building up the walls that guilt does, approaching it with grief builds bridges. So I think the underlying characteristic of all of this is just that willingness. You have to be okay with embracing discomfort, butting heads with some people, having conversations you really might not feel like having that day. And also just taking the initiative and initiating, because I've been fortunate that I've had a lot of my white friends reach out to me, like, hey, what can we do? What's up? What's going on? And I'm all about it. But there has to be that willingness, because it's a two-way street like any relationship. And I know a lot of people probably right now are fighting some sort of fatigue. They're feeling a little helpless right now. And I would really ask those of you who feel helpless to step into, again, the shoes of the Black community. How much worse is it for them hearing Eric Garner say, I can't breathe in 2014? 6 years later, hearing George Floyd say, I can't breathe in 2020. I thought we were past this. This is 6 years later. Or even going back further through our history in America, we're kind of tired. And it's exhausting, and you feel helpless. You're like, really? We've had all this awareness and nothing's changed? So it is discouraging. But also, I really do hope that through all this, the allies are willing to step up and just say, I still have a sphere of influence. I can reach people. So, yes, Sarah.
Oh no, finish.
Oh, sorry, okay. Sorry, different mode. But yeah, so, and I find myself getting discouraged at times too, because I'm thinking, well, I can't reach everyone. How am I supposed to? Because I'm not big on social media. I have it. I'd like to see my friends doing well. I don't post anything. But so I get kind of discouraged. I'm like, what can I do? But then I realize my own way of having a platform is having these one-on-one conversations with people. I'm fortunate to have been president of BALSA and now transitioning into my 3L representative role this coming year. I have a platform where I can use to have these tough conversations and then reach friends who might not be met with these opposing perspectives, and then they can reach their coworkers, whether that be in California, in Texas, North Carolina, Florida, wherever they have their own spheres of influence. I can plant that seed and they can amplify Black voices. They can show them, what one Black person has to say and hopefully broaden their perspective. So to also those who feel just kind of helpless and discouraged, know that we appreciate them being our allies in just the same way, like we want to be their allies as they're trying to help us figure it out. We want to navigate this route together.
Right.
A couple of
Sarah,
things.
go ahead.
Okay, so I think that it's important to think about bystander intervention too. I remember last fall, I walked into a board meeting. I was the only Black person. It was a lot of wealthy white men, and somebody said something and I just couldn't believe that they said it. All I wanted to do was to go to the board meeting, to just sit there and to drink my little Diet Coke with whatever brownie they provided us. But once again, I'm finding myself raising my hand, being the only person in the room, and having to say something because I don't have the privilege not to, and I'm not a Black person who passes. So I have to speak, I have to, I don't have the privilege to just sit through a meeting without listening to what's going on, because something might need to be said. And that doesn't mean that I'm always on, the sort of lookout for somebody saying something racist or inappropriate, but that's sort of another example of white privilege. And then I did want to talk a little bit about bystander intervention. Bystander intervention is when a person hears, and this is a really important role of allies, but a person might overhear two people talking about something that is frankly racist, and instead of not doing anything, that person may say, hey, is that your understanding? Or did you read XYZ article? Or, you know, another example is with the rise in Asian American hate crime during COVID-19, speaking up, you know, when somebody is saying something to an Asian American, and it can be as easy as just, you know, dropping a bag of chips to, or just to basically stop the conversation or stop the blame that was happening against that Asian American person. And that's another way, the bystander intervention, to be a really good ally. And the third thing, I must apologize, Reggie, but the third thing that I was going to say, and I know we're going to get into this later, but there's this idea of not being racist versus anti-racism. And I think to be a true ally, you have to be really up for being an anti-racist.
Okay, and that's good. Tyrone, I'm going to come to you. Van Jones, I think it was Van Jones on CNN a week or so ago, he talked about the asymptomatic spread of racism. And I thought that was just a brilliant use of the COVID-19 word, because it is, whenever we're silent, when we're in a group and somebody says something and that affects another group of people, like say somebody talks about the Asian community and we don't say anything about it, now we're part of the asymptomatic spread of that racism. And it's kind of a duty to say something. You don't have to get in a big fight, but to say something about it. And your microphone is still off, Tyrone.
Sorry about that. I have 3 young kids, and so I keep myself muted because there's blurting and all whatnot going on behind me. So no, I absolutely agree. You know, with privilege comes power, right? Power, you know, privilege is power. It's this white privilege is this sort of ability to go through life without having those same barriers that folks of color, specifically Black folks, have, right? And with great power comes great responsibility, right? I'm a big comic book nerd. So, you know, if you're that white person who's sitting in a meeting and you're seeing something like this go on, if you're hearing these comments, if you know that there needs to be more diversity in your organization or your company or your firm, and you know that if the Black associate, the Black partner, or the Black coworker speaks up, they're going to get side eyes because they think, oh, well, of course, you know, they're pushing for more diversity. You know, realize you have this sort of this power to be able to step into these spaces and be heard and not be ostracized and not be sort of, you know, dissected in your opinions because of this privilege. And so I think, you know, by having more white folks being good allies and actually recognizing this power and, you know, flexing that white privilege power for good, you can start to see that sort of incremental change, right? This is that sort of everyday change we talk about. Everyone wants to know, what can we do now with the movement, right? And there's very sort of cognizable things you can do. But in going through your daily life, if you're just sort of aware of your privilege and you see injustice and you know that you have the power to step in and not have, you know, your own self sort of stepped on because of where you are and who you are, then you need to flex that. And I think that if that's just sort of an ongoing theme in people's lives who have awakened and recognized this, then I think you'll start to see not necessarily these big waves of systematic changes, but just sort of fundamental changes that we're seeing in all of our institutions across the board, our judiciary, our companies, our law firms, our organizations that serve the community.
Judge Jackson, as you look at what the Black community is facing, and you know the pandemic has hit our community harder than most, the economic calamity has hit our community harder than most, and now these racial injustices continue to hit us even at this point. What do you say to the Black community that to have hope in times like this?
Well, Reggie, first of all, let me just say that for me, I'm 74 years of age. This is sort of like post-traumatic stress disorder. I have been dealing with, watching incidents since I was 17 years old. I go back to my first year of college. That was 1963. That was the year that the 4 young girls at the Birmingham church were killed. My second year of college, I had a friend that was in Selma that walked that bridge. 1968, that was my second year of law school. That was the year that Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy were assassinated. And then we get to 1992, Rodney King. My sister and her family were living in Los Angeles. So what I'm just saying is that this is like post-traumatic stress disorder for me. The type of emotional drain that me as a 74-year-old is dealing with. So when we talk about hope, where is the hope? Well, the hope for me is that there will be a change for my grandchildren. The hope for me is that in this room, this telecast, there are 491 individuals that are interested in hearing from us, that are potential allies, that are going to be people that will speak out, that are going to be anti-racist, which means that every day they will actively work towards dismantling racism and institutional barriers. So the hope is the young people on this panel, the people in this room, the people that are out there protesting. These are young people. These are people that have ideals. And so that is the hope for me and the hope for the Black community and what will keep me pushing on.
Thank you, Judge. And just want to remind everybody that it's 5:17 now. In about 13 minutes, we will start our Q&A session and take some of the questions that Amy and SJ are compiling. And but I want to go to you, Carrie. As a member of the legislature, you are one of the architects of the future. And so what are your thoughts about the Black community and having hope for change in the future?
I'm also hopeful, and I think some members of on the panel have mentioned like lifting your voice. I think, and really getting a broad group of people supporting and having people putting kind of their money where their mouth is. Like you say that you're supportive, show up to these meetings, come to the committee hearings, talk to your legislators, express why this is important. I think honestly that it is going to take sort of another generation of change. I mean, just speaking really candidly, and we have to keep pushing, like I said, these policy changes. But I see it, and I'm 36 years old, and I see a huge difference even in the last 10 years. I was in law school and then started practicing in Boston before I came back to Denver, and I see sort of shifting. And one thing that was really sort of silencing when we were at the legislature, BLM and several of the protests were just right outside the House chamber. So we are debating on the police accountability bill, and you could hear the crowd chanting, no justice, no peace, no justice, and just throughout the day. And then when we went and looked out there, it was all young people. And so to Judge Jackson's point, I think, I find hope in young folks. I find hope in young legislators like myself, in my contemporaries. I find hope in, and knowing that we stand on, the shoulders of giants, as everyone says, but just not taking for granted how, for me, obviously I'm an elected official, not taking for granted how important every level of election is. Like I said, Tay Anderson, Denver School Board, he's orchestrated tremendous change already in a short amount of time. Water boards, there are all sorts of boards. So for me, I think getting people elected that reflect your values and reflect the courage that you want people to bring forth in office, that's what gives me hope. And we saw, like I said, we saw some of that leveraging in 2 weeks in the legislature. But there are really powerful forces at the state level and at the federal level, and we need, I think, equally powerful forces to combat that. And that starts with, like I said, a sort of a new generation of leaders who are ready to take up the task.
That's great. Well, Chris is definitely one of those young leaders. And Chris, I want to get your thoughts about the hopefulness of the future and the idea of a colorblind society, and whether we should be or if it's possible for us to be a colorblind society.
Sure, I'll address the first your first question about hopes for the future. I'll take that one first. Again, it's that optimism. I mean, even in my short experience, I haven't really seen this many people stepping up collectively across the board as now. So it's really encouraging, and seeing kind of the sweeping reforms that are being made is wildly encouraging. It's really great to see, and I think it's a good starting point. But I think we need to do more. If we're speaking about police reform, I think the measures in place now are really great, but that's after something has happened. We need to start from the ground up. Also, we can't just go top down. It needs to go top down and bottom up and meet in the middle. We need to do something preemptive to prevent these things from happening, and when they do, have measures in place for when this stuff happens. But ideally, we'll be at a point where we don't have to worry about it. With the idea of a colorblind society, I personally think it's important to see people for who they are, for their color, to appreciate their backgrounds, to know what they come from, to know their heritage and what informs their perspective and where they come from. It's important to know their struggles, to at least empathize with their experience. So when it comes to seeing things colorblind, I think that's a disservice to people of color, because we need to be respected and we need to be seen for what we experience on a daily basis, both what we've overcome and what we face, and also the value we bring and the diverse perspectives and experiences we bring to our seat at the table. And I think it's so important to remember that those identities are vital and to keep with us. Even though once we have equality and greater representation, we still need to see people for where they come from. That's what makes us human beings. That's what makes us who we are, and each one of us unique, and why it's so important to maintain that.
Yeah, I think that when I think about cubicles at the office, when you show up, people have pictures of their family and their pets and vacations they took. That's such a part of who they are. And I think our race, our gender, our nationalities, all of that is part of who we are. And we can celebrate all of who we are and not try to aim for a society in which we don't notice anything about each other. Sarah, did you have something?
Well, Reggie, let's be clear here. I mean, and this is, I'm a little bit older than Chris, and there were generations, a couple of generations in the 70s and 80s where really you had this colorblind movement. And you're now seeing it now in the people who are around my age and a little bit older. And the fact is, there are no purple people, or there are no green people, and people are not colorblind. But what happened as a result is you have this whole generation, or at least decades of people who were taught that they can't talk about race because they're supposed to be colorblind. And we have to talk about race to do it what we're trying to do right now in America, right? And so to not have conversations about race is absolutely detrimental to what all of our callings are about. It's also another example of white privilege, because white parents could talk to their kids about being colorblind and could explain to their kids about race the way that they wanted to. That was not happening in the Black and brown communities, where you are taught about race at a very, very young age. And, studies show that at the age of 10, you're well aware, and all kids are well aware of race and how they're different from one another. But the differences and the diversity is what makes it great when we all put our minds together, like Judge Jackson said. It makes for a better judiciary. It makes for a better law firm. It makes for better law schools. It makes for better legal departments. Diversity.
That's great. And it's 5:25, and I think let's go into our questions. And I want to aim the first one at you, Tyrone. That is, question comes in: how do you think we can continue the momentum to make policy changes that will lead specifically to fairness, safety, and trust as we interact with each other? And your microphone is off, Tyrone.
Yeah, I think that it's important, a few things for people to stay informed, right? I think that the hyper focus that people have had on issues during this COVID-19 time has yielded what I see as the momentum in this movement. People need to stay informed. They also need to stay engaged, right? So not just sort of doing your homework on the history and what sort of comprises systematic racism, but what's going on now. What's going on in our legislature, what's going on with our local leaders. When you're looking at all of this change right now, it's not coming at the federal level, right? It's coming at, with leaders like Tay Anderson, like at the school board level. It's coming with, leaders like our representatives in the House and the Senate, right? It's coming at the local level. It's coming from our municipalities, right? It's coming from states. Stay engaged in those sorts of politics. Don't just check in every 4 years when there's a presidential election. And then be prepared to act, and if you're engaged, you should have some ideas of what you can do. You might want to ask permission, but, don't just show up and talk to your friends of color and expect them to sort of guide you and point you in the right direction. Come to them with some ideas, field some ideas, and then get in there and act. And I think there's a difference between these big waves of change, one that we're seeing right now and one that I think we need to sort of ride as long as we can. I think there's inevitably going to be a cycle. And that sort of everyday work, as allies and as Black people that we do to make sure that we're combating racism, just the everyday stuff that we do when we're recognizing our privilege and we're making sure that we're flexing our privilege. And I think as long as we stay plugged in, as long as we stay engaged, ultimately we're going to sort of see those changes happening bit by bit, and then in these larger, more cyclical waves, which is I think what we're on right now.
Gotcha. Judge Jackson, I want to direct this question to you. Someone asked, in addition to what was already discussed about being an ally, what can those of us in law enforcement do?
Well, I think that people in law enforcement, we hear about the blue line. We hear about the allegation that it is only a few bad apples that are causing the poor reputation for the majority of police officers. And I, having been both a district attorney, a U.S. attorney, having relatives that have been members of the police department and fire departments, I know that there are a ton of good men and women that are in these fire departments and in these police departments. But it is what you can do is you cannot be silent. You cannot let the bad behavior of someone else taint you or taint your group, your organization. It's like what we've talked about. People have to speak up. I think that police officers and fire departments, like teachers, like psychologists, they're in a position of trust. And when you're in a position of trust, you have a higher responsibility. And when you have this higher responsibility, if someone is doing something wrong, it must be reported. It must be confronted. And it takes individual active opposition to something that is wrong. There's got to be a change with police unions. And so that conversation has to take place within the ranks of police unions so that the police unions recognize that there's a movement going on for a change. So these are just my thoughts in terms of what someone within the police department does as an individual. And
Very
if
good.
you're an individual member of a police union and you're going to a membership meeting, there's got to be the voice raised.
Thank you, Judge. Carrie, I want to ask you from a legislative perspective. We have a question that came in about Tabor and the challenges that it represents. It says, can you comment on how we need to address the barriers to reform that Tabor presents and how we can invest in the infrastructure to reform the racist constructs that hold black people?
So probably most folks on the phone know Tabor is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. What that says is it's the most restrictive tax and spending clause in the country, and it's here in Colorado. It means that no level of government can raise taxes. Your municipal, government, your school board, or school districts. No one can raise taxes. It has to go to the vote of the people. And the practical import is it means we have not been able to raise the revenues that we need in order to invest in our communities, particularly as Colorado grows in the way that it has. So you will actually see some ballot measures this year that won't tackle all of Tabor, but will try and address some of the disparities in our tax system. It's really, it can't be a legislative change, actually. It has to be a constitutional change. So it's got to be either a referred measure or a citizen petition. But that said, there are other things that we have been working on at the legislative level, and then advocates and community organizers have been trying to piece together to get some of the revenues that we need to actually address these shortcomings. So, COVID-19, this pandemic, we saw a $3.3 billion shortfall in the general fund budget, which is a huge hit to the budget. And at a time when people, in my opinion, need government most, think of unemployment, think of infrastructure, schools, we're forced to reduce the size of government and cut and cut and cut. Judges took pay cuts. We're asking law enforcement to make big investments, and yet the county level governments are going to see huge budget shortfalls. So the long and short of it is, it goes back to getting involved at the local level, familiarizing yourself and voting and supporting these initiatives that are meant to try and remove some of these big hurdles that we have in the Colorado legislature that literally no other state in the country has.
Chris, we have a question that's directed toward you. It says, at DU Law, student organizations are honing in on how to provide better spaces for minority students. One thing I'm very worried about is our low retention rate of BIPOC students. Any tips on increasing that number? And what does BIPOC mean? Do you know?
So I'm fortunate enough to be on a couple of those, on the end, as part of the affinity groups that are making efforts to hopefully improve retention for students of color at DU. I think this year was a really big wake-up call for the administration, in that we did see a pretty significant drop in students of color from the first semester to the second semester. And so I think the biggest thing right now is that the administration at DU can do to really retain it is to listen to the affinity groups. And we've been really having meetings with both members of the Rocky Mountain Collective for Race, Place, and Law, the Dean of Students, and other professors of color. And we're really trying to present a unified argument to the Dean of like a concrete list of demands that we are asking for. Just, we need more scholarships. Financially, there's a lot of hoops that people have to jump through to go to law school. And that's a really substantial obstacle for a lot of people. In the same way, it's hard being a student of color at DU. I'm fortunate in that my experience has been really good. I don't necessarily share the same experience, because I acknowledge I come from a place of privilege and that I'm lighter than many of my Black counterparts, right? But that being said, I'm one of 4 Black students in the class of 226 in the Rising 3L class at DU. It becomes especially apparent when I'm in a constitutional law class and we're speaking about affirmative action, for example, or with the Pledge to Diversity program, which is a fantastic program offered by the Colorado legal community that places students from diverse backgrounds with companies and large law firms to get that corporate experience. And I've been told I've been getting a handout because I'm participating in it. So that's a problem with the mentality of some students in that school. And I just ask that if they're going to say something like that, they'd be willing to have a discussion and back it up, not just, drop a live grenade on us with that kind of comment and run away. We need to be able to sit down and have that kind of discussion. So I think they put on a lot of seminars for diversity and inclusion, and they're typically during lunch hour, which is when all those things take place. It's kind of hard to make it to all of them, so you have to have a list of priorities. I was really pleased this past year we had successful panels, which Mr. Glover was actually a part of one of those panels earlier this semester when we could meet in person. And I was really thrilled by that. And we had a member of the Little Rock Nine where we had record attendance for a lunch talk where it was standing room only in a room that was, capacity of 90 people. So creating that kind of presence has been a really good first start. So now we actually have a decent presence on campus. Now we need to do something with it because we have a space designated for students of color, but it's a small little study room of 4 seats. We might need a little more because we're trying to have a larger population. So I think that starts with scholarships. That starts with creating a space for students to talk. And it starts with creating awareness that there's diverse students on campus and there is a system of support. We're fortunate now that Patty Powell actually has a full-time position as a mentor and as Dana students with speaking with students of color and offering support and guidance with career choices, with academics, and navigating the whole law school journey. So we're starting to put things in place, and it's really good to people taking those steps. Now that we have this momentum, I really hope we can continue to seize that and make big asks, because this is our chance to really ask for things and create a space that people want to be a student of color and not where they feel like the token or like the representative for their entire race in certain classes, or where they feel singled out if they're talking about police violence in the criminal law class against minorities, or if they're portrayed as your stereotypical Black person who is a thug in whatever case that might be. You need to create that kind of awareness and create that space that you're welcome here, you belong here, and you have a seat at the table, and you can speak, and you can own that. You can own your existence and own your experience as a law student.
Thank you, Chris. And someone wrote in and said the BIPOC acronym stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And I want to go to Sarah asking about, can anyone comment on the recent movement to defund the police? What does that really entail, and what would that do for communities?
I think that's the question. What does it really entail, and what would it really do for communities? I think that we're seeing different states do different things and do different things for their citizens that might be different from what we would do here. But one of the major questions that people are asking is, what does it really mean to defund the police? I don't know if Tyrone, given his work, might have, or Carrie, Representative Tipper, might have a maybe better suited to really answer this question.
Sure.
Carrie?
Ahead, Carrie, please.
I actually thought Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gave an awesome answer to this. I don't know if anyone saw it. I think it was on Twitter. She was talking about, like, this isn't novel. Look at the suburbs. They have made investments in their communities, and they don't fund the police at the rates that, more of like our inner cities do. And I was thinking about this in Lakewood. Here's an example. Not too long ago, one elementary school was having some struggles, to put it mildly. And Lakewood PD looks at third grade reading levels to determine their staffing needs in the future, right? And I think that's a common benchmark. And there were a group of community activists that got together and said, rather than accepting that because the third grade reading levels at the school aren't where they should be, we're going to have to hire another 5 cops in 10 years, why don't we make the investment in getting those reading levels up and surrounding that school with multi sort of approaches, community-based, religious affiliations, everything. And that's exactly what happened. So I think defund the police doesn't mean like get rid of the police force and punish all police. It's let's think of where the biggest value, where the biggest return on our money is. And to me, when you look at certain communities, you see that investment in community, right? In raising people that have every opportunity instead of suppressing people, over policing people, and destining them basically to the futures that we see some folks having. School to prison pipeline, all those things. So I thought that was interesting perspective when you think about it. It's not this radical notion, it's just reprioritizing so that we don't need to make that investment, so that we have better outcomes.
And to Carrie's point, what the research does show is that the safest communities are the communities with the most resources. And so the resources do not equal additional policemen. but pumping in resources into the community, which certainly needs to happen in the Black communities in a major way.
Great. Tyrone, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really defund, divest, and then reinvest, right? We have this police system which, you know, has been built upon like systems of white supremacy over, you know, hundreds of years, right? It started with the slave catchers, the lynch mobs, right? They were supposed to protect the haves from the have-nots, Black people, right? And we've been tinkering with this system for decades. And we're just at a point where it's not working in the way that it's currently constructed, right? I mean, I guess it is working if you look at what it's intended to do. And you have these cities and you have these municipalities where there's, you know, hardly any investment in education and health and mental health, and, you know, access to justice, all of these different things, but you're pouring tons of money into the police and all of this money into militarizing the police, giving them, you know, more toys, more ways to essentially occupy these neighborhoods. And if you just started from the ground up, defund, and say, what does protect and serve for these communities really look like? They probably look a little bit more like what they look like in Lakewood, right? Or Highlands Ranch, right? Where there's lots of investment in infrastructure in schools and actually serving those people. There'd probably be a lot more sort of people in the government who are tasked with providing services, right? On mental health hold, having someone who's actually like showing up with lots of mental health training, who isn't armed to the teeth, right? And so defund, divest, and reinvest really is about just, you know, shaking the Etch-a-Sketch and starting from the ground up and really basing our policies around policing on how we best serve and protect and combat poverty, not just contain this population.
Judge Jackson, do you want to weigh in on this idea of defunding the police?
No, Reggie, we have seen over the last 20 plus years, different versions of community policing. And so to me, that's what we're talking about, is really community policing and what works best for the community. I think it's probably pretty clear that a lot of the work that the police do is the work that requires a psychologist, requires a social worker, requires someone that can mediate. You know, these are all the type of work that could be done by individuals that are not carrying a gun. And so it's just the question of what is the best community policing model. Just recently, I saw the chief of police in Camden, New Jersey, and Camden was one of the most violent and had one of the highest murder rates in the country. And they changed their model of policing, where there were more police officers that were on bicycles and on walking the beat and living within the community rather than not being outside the community. So this idea of community policing isn't new. This has been going on for decades. And I think if you go back to the Kerner Commission report back in 1968, there was discussion regarding community policing. So it's a question. It's an idea that has been around for almost 50 years, and it's a question of whether or not it can be applied effectively, and that you have police officers accepting new roles. So
yeah, and I want to give Chris a chance to weigh in on this topic as well, on this idea of defunding the police.
Sure. Without repeating too much of what's already been said, I know what Mr. Glover and Representative Tipper both talked about was, you know, education in the communities, reinvesting in those communities. And in the research that I had the opportunity to do in undergrad, when I was figuring out what contributed to these incarceration rates, at the core of it all was it was race, but also these underlying factors that also were affected by related to the race of the subjects of the research, right? So there was levels of educational attainment. The more educated someone is, someone was, the less likely they would wind up incarcerated. It was number of parents in the household. It was income of the family. So all these are interrelated. And so in this movement of, you know, defunding the police, it's not just getting rid of them, like they've already said, it's figuring out how to most effectively serve and protect those communities. And this just kind of reinforces that.
Sure. And I was thinking of an analogy the other day of I was at Quebec, or was at, Quebec and Leetsdale, waiting to make a left turn, but I didn't get the left turn arrow when I thought I was supposed to get a left turn arrow. And I'm like, hey, it just skipped us. And then we went through a whole nother cycle of the east-west traffic went, and then the other cars went, and then it skipped us again. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? This light is broken. And now I started formulating a plan. I was like, well, what am I going to do if it skips me a third time? I'm going to make an illegal U-turn and go back down Quebec, or I'm going to squeeze over into the lane, or I'm going to just make the left turn when there's a gap in traffic. And I started thinking, well, what if that was the case, that light was broken and I made an illegal U-turn, and many other people did too, and then police officer pulled me over and gave me a ticket, or is talking to me, and I'm trying to explain, well, the light was broken. Can't you see that the light was broken? And I had no choice. He gives me the ticket. When I go to court, I try to explain to the judge enforces the ticket, and this continues to happen. People have to make an illegal move at that turn because that light is broken, and the response from the city is not, let's go fix that light. The response from the city is, man, there are a lot of people breaking the law in that intersection. Let's send more police officers down there. So we send more police officers, they pull more people over. People start to get more and more frustrated by what's happening, and so the police get more aggressive, the people respond more aggressively. Pretty soon the police kill somebody, and the argument is, well, he shouldn't have resisted, or he shouldn't have whatever, when really it's like, well, did we need to have 80 police officers assigned to that intersection? What if we had just fixed the light? And I think that the defund the police movement is that kind of thinking. It's just, why don't we just try to fix the underlying problem rather than try to just continue to send more and more armed officers to solve these problems? And I want to, our final, I think we've gone through all the questions that were there. If you have any more, SJ, send them to me. But I'd like to give each of you kind of a final minute to wrap up and kind of finish this thing off. And so I am going to start with Tyrone, my bald brother.
All right. You know, I've been encouraged by what I've seen in the last few weeks, right? You know, seeing this many people en masse rise up, do some really hard introspection, and take some of that understanding and try to make it actionable. And I think that there's been some ground made. I think, unfortunately, it's, you know, the catalyst for it was all of this tragedy that we've all experienced. And, you know, just realize, you know, white allies, that your Black, you know, friends are still very much mourning, you know, much of what's gone on and the deaths in the wake of all of this. So while, you know, there is this sort of intoxicating energy around pushing forward, you know, in between all of that, you know, over the lunch hours, you know, we might be in our offices, you know, shedding some tears, because it is truly, you know, heartbreaking. But I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing. I think that there's going to be more ground gained through all of this, which is going to be great. But there's also going to be a counter movement, right? We saw it with the Obama administration, right? When he came into office, you know, there was a groundswell that eventually came back, like the MAGA folks and the Trump folks, right? So be ready not only to push forward, but to hold the line when that blowback ultimately comes, okay? Don't disengage. Be ready to keep, you know, folks that are pushing for the policies you want and you believe in office. You know, stay in tune. Don't get happy on a few wins. And so that's what I would say. You know, I don't know, you know, I have young children. I don't think we're going to solve this in my lifetime. And I think we're not going to solve it in their lifetime. I think that it is a problem that is really at the root of our country. And we can just never stop fighting. And we just need to just keep on taking forts and keep on, advancing battle lines and just keep holding those lines in the name of progress. And we just cannot afford to stop hoping.
Great. And Judge Jackson, as you are making your final comments, can you weave in a comment about the Colorado Supreme Court's recent missed opportunity to address systemic racism in the judicial system?
Well, as we know, under our Constitution, there are 3 branches of government, and the judiciary is the 3rd branch of government. The judiciary is actually the branch of government in which most of the population have a one-on-one contact with, some type of individual contact with, whether it be traffic court, whether it be family court where you're getting a divorce, whether it be probate court because someone has died. So our population more often is involved with the judicial branch. And that is why, to me, it is so important that we continue being activists, being anti-racist in terms of trying to make sure that the judiciary reflects the demographics of the citizens of Colorado. And so that is my concern. That is my passion. I think it's reflected in the judiciary has been the leader in the civil rights movement. If we look at the Supreme Court with Brown versus Board of Education, if we look at some of the courageous federal judges that had to make decisions in Arkansas and Mississippi regarding the segregation and the laws that were so oppressive to Black people, it was those judges that made those courageous decisions. And so what I'm urging is that the people in this room, that they continue to speak out on the importance of having a diverse judiciary, that the people in this room apply to be members of judicial nominating commissions, that people in this room, when they go to their Rotary clubs or whether or not they are just at home with friends, talk about the need for a more diverse bench. And what that means, diverse, is more Black judges, more Latino judges, more Asian American judges. Women are doing fine. And I shouldn't say doing fine because, there's, as Reggie points out, there are always obstacles that women face. But the critical need here in Colorado is Black and Latino judges. And so that will be my closing remark.
Thank you, sir. And I'm going to come to Carrie, then Chris, and then Sarah. But I do want to mention to everyone, we do want to encourage you to donate to the Center for Legal Inclusiveness. And I think that SJ is going to put, SJ or Lisa, I think are the names, are going to put a text in Facebook and in Zoom here with a link back to the website where you could make a contribution to support this organization. We would love it if you made a donation of $100 and became a member of CLI. We could definitely use your voice and your commitment to this organization to start to make change. And I see it's pasted in there. But Carrie, I want to go to you now with your final comments.
I probably sound a bit like a broken record, but echoing some of what Judge Jackson said. And I think also President Obama in his sort of outgoing speech, something he said that resonated with me is it was kind of like this angered call to action. He said, if you don't like what you see, like grab a clipboard and run for office. And it's true, be involved, but if you don't see the candidate that you want, you run. And you will find support in this room. You'll find support in me. I mean, truly, step up where you can. Chris, I was thinking, when I was in law school, we had a student position on the admissions committee. Something like that would be great if DU doesn't have it. But for me, I was personally interested in making sure that we had diversity reflected in our incoming class, as I know that you are as well. And then as a lawyer, I was shocked to find that I was one of the only bilingual attorneys in Boston, which has pulls from communities all over the world. And what I realized is, well, we can't just start in law school when people of color have had terrible experiences in Boston and want to get the heck out of here. We have to start cultivating at a much younger age, reaching out into community at elementary school, showing kids there's a place for you here and a path. So I think we have an obligation to be involved to every extent that we can, whether that's donating to candidates, donating to organizations, running for office yourself, helping others get elected, but also thinking about the people behind us and the generation that we have coming, and how do we elevate those voices and give them, you know, really the stepping stones and the power that they need to finish the job that we're starting.
Very good. Thank you. And Chris, your thoughts?
Good thing. Well, first off, I want to thank, again, this panel for including me to be a part of it. It's a huge honor to be, again, on a panel with so many fantastic people. Again, thank you to everyone in attendance for having that willingness to have an uncomfortable conversation and listen to some really tough questions and challenging perspectives. So I guess my closing remarks are, don't lose steam. You know, keep embracing that discomfort. Be willing to continue reaching out. Take the initiative. Just don't let your enthusiasm, don't let your frustration, don't let your desire to make positive change fade with the headlines, because those will fade. And we hope there's no more tragic headlines coming to light. Inevitably, there will be. But don't let each headline spark a new burst of energy. Keep it sustained. Keep fighting the good fight and try to fight fatigue. Talk with your friends of color. Talk with your family who might not share the same perspectives, and embrace those tough conversations and call people out. It's kind of the perspective of see something, say something, and step up. Again, by being here, it just demonstrates all of your willingness to have these difficult conversations. And I encourage you to continue spreading that message, spreading that mentality to your own circles of influence, because we can only reach so far, but with everyone collectively involved, it can make a world of difference. So thank you, and don't lose steam.
Very good, Chris. We appreciate you being here. And before I hand this off to Sarah, I just want to say thank you, Sarah, for organizing this. Thank you to the Center for Legal Inclusiveness for creating this, coming up with that idea, creating this, inviting these panelists, inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this and to be part of this conversation. I want to remind everyone that CLI will hold their virtual summit in August. It's August 10th through the 14th at noon every day. There'll be a town hall follow-up to this event on August 13th. And so you can learn more about it by going to their website at centerforlegalinclusiveness.org. Thank you again, Sarah, and please, your final thoughts.
I just want to say thank you to this wonderful panel. I learned so much. I am looking at the comments and looking at people being very grateful for having this town hall, having this forum where we can all come together and ask some really difficult questions and have some hard conversations. Remember, we also didn't think we would see a Black president in our lifetime. And yes, we saw the backlash from that, but perhaps now it's our turn again. I encourage all of our allies to call themselves allies and to know that they have the right to call themselves allies so long as they maintain that empathetic view and want to learn. I encourage allies not only to be allies, but to be anti-racist too, and to every day have this at the forefront of their mind. What decisions are they going to make sure that they're not falling in the group of I'm just not a racist. With respect to our legal system, it's all about diversity and inclusion. And I know that sort of sounds interesting from where I sit. However, we can do so much better. We can do so much better, and we need to come together and figure out how to do it. We need so much more education. CLI needs so many more resources so that we can continue programming like this. So we can continue programming like the virtual town hall meeting, like the conversation that Chris Martin and I are going to have on July 16th as part of our Getting It Right series. CLI is looking to you so we can do the diversity and inclusivity work for you. This is a major way that you can give. George Floyd was being murdered for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I encourage everybody, every member of this panel and everybody watching to think of 9 things that they can do tonight to implement and create change. 9 things. It doesn't have to be too complicated. It could be get 9 people registered to vote, sign up 9 more mentees to your list, help 9 people fill out the census, donate to 9 different organizations, CLI being one of them. But I really encourage people to think about doing 9 things in Mr. Floyd's name. And I just want to thank you, Reggie, so much for donating your time and for agreeing to lead this discussion and moderate. And thank you again to all of our wonderful panelists. I know how busy you are, and for taking your time out of your busy schedules to speak with us tonight. And I am thrilled with the outcome. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for making this appointment and joining us tonight. We hope that it was valuable to you, that you learned and grew from it. I know that I did, and I think I can speak for all of us on this panel that this was a conversation that we enjoyed, to hear these different perspectives. And on the subject of doing something in 9s, you could donate $900 to the Center for Legal Inclusiveness, or $9,000, or any other multiple of 9. But we appreciate any level of support that you can offer. You can learn more about their upcoming events by going to their website, centerforlegalinclusiveness.org. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.